Into the very exciting innovation process, and I'm a huge fan of Dr. Lawson's, and his experiences I think will be very relevant for the crowd here today. And what I want to start with is essentially the classic idea, which I think how it sparks. And a lot of people in this room, it may resonate with you, where you have moments of frustration and you think this could be done better, or you have a recurring, repeating problem and you see others around you experiencing this same problem. And this is kind of how the innovation process starts. And Dr. Lawson has a classic example in a company that he founded called Innovator. And so if you could just give us a brief overview of that story, which I enjoy hearing every time.
Thanks, Neela, thank you. And full disclosure, her twin sister, yes, I have worked with and in the medical field here at Duke University, where I've spent most of my adult career. So Innovator, interesting. So a little bit about, I think, a little element of entrepreneurship or successful innovation is when sort of preparation meets opportunity. And by a little of the bio that was previously, I sort of prepared for a long time in a way of learning about surgery and learning about science and actually working and consulting with companies who were making things, and I kind of learned incrementally different steps in the process. And then, you know, if you work in like I do as a surgeon and as a vascular surgeon, you have a lot of opportunities for innovation because we have a lot of problems. I mean, you can just walk down the clinic ward and find a problem in every room. And I don't mean to be, and there's an opportunity for innovation in every room if you think about it. And in this particular case, I was taking care of a patient who has a very difficult clinical problem that often goes or is on dialysis. And in doing so, you have to connect their body to a machine 3 times a week with large bore needles, which sounds kind of trivial until you think about actually doing the hookup and what a patient has to go through in that environment. And those hookups, because they get accessed so frequently, often fail and or get infected and or rupture. And if then you think about it from a biology and an engineering standpoint, and I get called to fix those things when they fail and rupture as emergencies because people bleed all over their kitchen and all kinds of horrible things happen, you would say there's got to be a better way to do this. And so in one classic case where there's an emergency of one of these dialysis grafts, you know, hemorrhaging effectively and taking it to the operating room as an emergency. I remember finishing the case, realizing how much it almost jeopardized this person's life, so really true unmet need, and how much it cost the health system, a couple $100,000 when everything was done. New surgery, resurgery, hospital administration just sort of came up with a very simple napkin drawing. I told Neela about it, but a napkin drawing about there's got to be a better way to engineer a simple thing to be cannulated. And then I thought, well, it can't be protectable, it's so obvious. And in fact, I went to the attorneys at Duke and they said, well, it looks like it might be protectable. And so we formed a company around it called an Innovator after some trying to get that company shopped to some big device manufacturers who said, go de-risk it. I said, that's a good lesson, go de-risk it. And so we formed a company and built some capital around it and ended up taking that company all the way to ultimate acquisition and exit. But it was a very simple device designed specifically to be cannulated, which nothing else had been engineered uniquely for a subset of dialysis patients, which sounds trivial in some ways until you're either one of those patients or you realize that vascular access for dialysis and dialysis care is the #1 leading line item in the Medicare budget because of the expense and the burden that chronic health conditions like that cost. So it's a huge unmet clinical need, incredibly expensive, and a very simple innovation to solve a problem like that.
I love that. So you talked about going to Duke University, you know, the attorneys there. universities can be such a support system in innovation process. Have you ever experienced them being a barrier, or, sometimes the bureaucracy in a university system or an academic setting can create maybe not the most fast-moving kind of environment? How did it work for you with Duke? Were they able to match your speed and support you?
I'd say my experience at Duke has been great. I mean, I've been able to build a handful of companies now and had some of them exit in different ways. So, but I'm also persistent, and I was able to present compelling cases sometimes to move things forward. So but in that sense, and I live now at the interface between the university ecosystem and then the sort of entrepreneurial, sort of truly the tech transfer life is what I live. But the university is meant for discovery and meant for kind of great ideas having a home to grow. But they're not really, because their incentives aren't aligned to create and sell something, other than maybe education or something, or provide laboratory space for people to get funding and do discovery work. They're not really good at taking that discovery work and figuring out how to get it out the door to commercialize it. And I think they would admit that, and I say that as a longtime Duke faculty, but also on the other side running companies that were spin-outs. And I find that is the biggest gap, is how to provide the early team that can take a cool idea from a really bright engineer, biomedical engineer, or cardiologist, or somebody who's got a new gizmo. They spend 20 years trying to be a good cardiologist or trying to become a good funded scientist in a university, and that's what they do really well. They don't know how to raise capital. They don't know really how to get IP and how to block their IP and position it. And unfortunately, the university, their incentives, if you ask, well, what are they? Well, they'd like to license their intellectual property to companies and get royalties out of that. And they want to see their faculty be successful and every once in a while get credit for inventing something. But they don't have a financial incentive that's very significant about selling something. They care if I get another grant funded because they get indirect costs. But they don't really care if I ever sell something, because they don't, other than a very, very small slice of royalty, they don't have a huge incentive. So they don't do a great job in company formation, raising early capital, building a team that understands something about how companies need to be run, and actually getting good outside counsel with a firm like yours.
That's great. And in talking about access to capital, and like you said, the university isn't that resource for clinicians who are kind of, found the idea and they have, the ability and the next step, they want to take that next step. Tell us about your experience as the first time kind of stepping out of that world and into the, private capital world and recognizing I need, funds to scale this, to grow this, to test and validate. And how was that experience for you? Did you have a mentor that helped kind of introduce you to the world? Did you just right through the brick wall? Tell us about that experience.
So, thanks, good question. I would say I was fortunate as a physician scientist to be both busy clinically as well as build a well-funded laboratory. And what I learned about funding my laboratory to do the work I wanted to do is it was like funding a company. I had to take an idea, sell my idea, have my idea be criticized, publish my idea, and then I'd get a grant funded. Well, that's a lot of a model for actually getting a company funded, as you would guess. And I had a well-funded lab, so raising money for my ideas was not novel. Doing it, there's a little bit of a barrier that clinicians and scientists sometimes, now it's more popular than it was 20 years ago when I started doing it, but if you're going to a company, that somehow is a kind of a dark transition, as opposed to my model, which is I'm just trying to finish my research project and get my idea out into humans, which I always said I wanted to do. But that means I got to get access to capital. And there is a sort of, there's relatively effective ways to fund early ideas through the NIH, the national, NSF. And they used to be pretty reliable. Currently, it's a little more unstable due to our political climate, but we'll see how that sorts out. The early access for early ideas is a pretty hard hard place to walk, and I help actually run a fund now that is university-centric for early, couple $100,000 here, a couple $100,000 there, but that's enough. That's enough to get a 3D printed prototype of something to make an early pitch deck sometimes. You can't pay a CEO, you can't pay, you can't raise, but you can raise enough money, a couple $100,000 here and there, to start to get that early catalytic money that lets you get a reasonable pitch deck. But then you still have to find the people who, usually family offices, if you have friends and family, maybe some early looking VCs that are particularly knowledgeable in, let's say, early life science. But that's a pretty narrow country of people to walk in. And unfortunately, most of the capital lives out in some things that are much more de-risked and would come in where you're raising bigger money for bigger things, but you pretty much know what you're doing by that stage. So there is unfortunately, a lot of the universities don't have funding mechanisms for that first, let's say, $1 million. That is no longer NIH money, and you're not big enough for it to be traditional investor VC type money, and you got to hit that sweet spot of getting that catalytic money, as I've learned to call it.
When you get money, strings come attached with it sometimes. And when you talked about having funds to hire a CEO and whatnot, tell us about your experiences, whether you personally or you've seen, fellow colleagues who cross, into the enterprise world, how it is to overcome sometimes the learning curve of going from being in control in an operating room, over a patient, over, being an expert in your domain, to being in a C-suite role where it may, there may be skill sets that you haven't, developed over 20 years of expertise, and how you overcame that, or others you've seen helped overcome that.
Well, I think there's maybe a two-part answer to that question, but the latter one, I think that, and it's a hard thing for particularly a lot of people that have trained for a long time, are very accomplished and very smart. That usually comes with an ego. And it comes with an ego that has a habit of controlling things, and I would say that have been guilty of that in certain,
Me too.
Me too, but anyway. But to make an idea move forward and to build a company, and I learned this even building my lab, especially if I was building my lab while I was in the operating room, while I was flying around the country trying to give lectures, I had to trust people. It means I had to build people around me that could do a lot of the work, and I think that's very similar in a company at some point, especially if you're going to maintain some kind of clinical, scientific, whatever role your own ego needs to maintain, you need to hand off certain things. And I find that the biggest barrier when I've talked to colleagues who are on the medical science side is getting their ego out of the room and being able to hand off something to a partner, to a colleague, and trust them. And the other one that people are very nervous about who don't know is that you asked, the first part of your question was a little bit about the money. I've had some both very good experience and very bad experiences with how the money comes in and the strings with the money. I've had some VC money that was really, I would never do again. I've had some VC money that was incredibly helpful because the approach was to help the company be successful, not torture them about their own stake in their own fund. And it changed the way those two different companies ran. And so I think the money you need, because you need money just like you need smart people to make your idea grow, but the money you get and the strings and how much equity you might have to give or a board seat or other things that will change the operational control does need a strategy. You don't just take money because it's there. And in fact, I was part of one company where we actually I think we made a mistake. We raised too much money too quickly. Ever hear that problem? We raised too much money too quickly. And we didn't have enough grit in our engineering process to make it lean enough that when we got to the finish line, it was too doggone expensive. And you don't realize until the end that the cogs, really, that you try to see that you're so cool, you're making this thing, and it's too doggone expensive. And then, to Peter Marks mentioned, is to change the manufacturing process and go back in time and change it materially, you can't do it over. Or you can, but only under great pain of either your runway or your timeline, and your board doesn't want to hear that. So, you know, you need to structure the money you need appropriately with the stakes you give up. And I would say one of the companies I helped run, we almost had too much money and made our process too fat. And if we had been leaner, we would have done a better job. I don't know. It's hard to believe I could say that, but it's true.
And with that, I mean, I will say, we sometimes hear from life sciences companies this balance that they have to strike from the pressure of their investors to, innovate and move quickly, and then balancing patient safety and patient care. And I don't know if you've ever had an experience with that, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that and working with investors that may not have the clinical or medical background or healthcare background, and if you think that makes a difference in how they approach and maybe add to the process or not.
It's a great question, and so as a physician, I'm always a physician, and I will never not be a physician. I don't care how much money we raise. I don't care if the company goes public. You have to be the moral compass of what's in the best interest of what you're doing for the people you're trying to care for. Now, in the concept of creating a technology and financing a technology that might help make people better, if you keep your eye on that, that's fine. I have worked with people who do not have their eye on that, and I found that very unsatisfying, and I found myself morally conflicted. And I simply have made a choice now. I just don't do that anymore. I don't, and I know other people can, and if they want to, that's their business. But I like to do things that help people. That's why I became a physician in the first place. I like to do things that help people that are cool, and that might make a difference. And that also means how strategically I raise money and who I work with when I raise money. And if they don't care about that, then I don't work with them. I don't mean that, but that's just where I've gotten to in my own journey. There are times when I didn't have that level of confidence, and I took probably bad money from the wrong people. And I'll never do that again.
Well, and Dr. Lawson now is starting a fund and will be, you're going full circle now, right? So now you're going to be the resource on the other side, kind of paying it forward, giving it back in a sense. I'm excited to see the lucky, ventures that you invest in, because they'll benefit greatly from your experiences. Talk to us. I want to talk about kind of the team that you talked about. Love for you to talk about Sean and some others. I'll just say this. So Dr. Lawson had 2 companies running at the same time while he was on sabbatical. And so when he told me sabbatical, I mean, I had a totally different version of what a sabbatical would be for me. His was running 2 companies, having a team running his clinic at Duke. And I was so overwhelmed because I complain about the 24 hours I have in my day and what I can't accomplish. And he has done so much. Tell us a bit about Humacyte and how you were able to manage all of these things and at the same time, based on what I've heard from my sister, still be one of the top providers at Duke, and with patients that adore you and have had the most high quality care, how you balanced all of that.
You're way too kind, but anyway, thank you for even the implication that but it is true that I was able to maintain a meaningful footprint as a physician and a surgeon and a vascular surgeon while we figured out how to run and build and finance companies, plural. And that required actually the first thing I said earlier is you have to trust people, you have to empower people, you have to take the time to train people. And to your point, so I've worked with some great people around me, both scientifically, both engineering, both administratively, and even clinically. And as you mentioned, Sean Gage is a physician assistant or PA that I worked with directly. And I got him to the point where he could really pretty much run my clinic and help a great deal in the OR, but knew when he needed to check in, a level of trust, but that required me to have a level of trust that he had also been trained and mentored to provide the level of care for the patients that I wanted. And in the same sense, at the company level, You have to have a good team of people around you. You have to have an operating officer that's going to keep the trains running on time. You have to have a financial officer who's going to help you if you're trying to take a company public, as we were. And it's not like I've done that a bunch, not that anybody does it a bunch of times, but I'm now a physician surgeon guy who's helping run a company that we're taking to the public markets. I can't do that myself. I got to have a good CFO who actually knows what he's doing. And then I have to, I become the communicator in chief. And in some ways so I used to joke, I don't do anything. I just talk to a lot of good people around me, and they do all the work. And then I have to you do have to communicate both. I'd say the other key is communicating up to a board or the medical institution leadership. So when I'm on a sabbatical, that just means I didn't leave my job. And they like me enough that they kept my seat open. Whenever all this other thing goes away, I can still go back to being a doc, which is just fine. That's a great job. But I got to communicate to them. I got to communicate to my board. I also have to communicate to the people that are working not below me, but actually with me, both in the hospital and in the clinic or in the laboratory. And so it requires communicating and being the educator in chief, as I say. Anyway.
Love that. Can you talk to us about what you think is the biggest challenge in having a clinical idea and then getting it to something that's, commercialized or an actual viable product? Do you think, regulatory issues, or is it, having a patient subset or population that you can test on? What do you think is kind of the one thing or a few things that stand in the way the most that may be the biggest barrier for people who say, that's just too much work, I can't?
So I've learned there are a lot of smart people. There are a lot of great biomedical engineers, there are a lot of great surgeons, there are a lot of great, and they all have frustrations, and a lot of them have very good solutions. But the activation energy to get that frustration in the OR from the thing that doesn't work right, or the patient flow thing that doesn't work right, to actually take the steps. And sometimes they just don't know what to do. And when your day is so busy and there's so much other pressure on, in like just an example of my world, it's not unique to any other, but like getting your patients through the system of the OR and turning your rooms over and talking to your families and getting your charts coded. Well, if during the day you had a great idea about how to make this device to make this surgery better, you probably were pretty excited about that. And you went to lunch, you thought about it, but by the end of the day, and it's 7 o'clock at night, and you're coding your charts and you're thinking about if you're gonna make dinner to even say goodnight to your kids, you usually don't write down the intellectual property. And if you don't write down the intellectual property, as all you do is a month later, you get frustrated by the same problem and say, doggone it, I should have written that down. So I see that it's really hard for that initial barrier to get an idea, an innovative thing kind of codified, so that because if you don't have IP, you don't have anything. No one will invest in your frustration unless your frustration has a solution that is backed by intellectual property. So I think that is one. But people knowing how to do that when the ideas are organically derived by frustration, right there in the clinic, right there in the OR, right there in the hospital, you see it every day. Just people don't know how to get that lift. I'd say the other place I see a lot of things. If you can figure out how to tell your story, I think you can get funded. You got to be able to tell your story. You got to tell your story with passion. You got to explain the unmet need. But most people are actually relatively good at that if they have a story to tell. Where there's a huge failure point is in the amount of money you need to raise, because most physicians are very humble, like, I can just do it with $50,000 or something. And it's like, no. So I've learned to say you need to be real serious about real money. And you don't need to be embarrassed by that. If it's going to take you $10 million to do this thing, then you got to go and you got to tell people, I need $10 million to get this done, and don't apologize for it. I think the place where people miscalculate, and there's a lot of bad advice out there, especially in the medical device, medical drug, early stage life science biotechnology, is in the lift with the regulatory strategy to get something bright with the FDA. The amount of time, the strategy it takes to get there, the amount of sort of maneuvering within your manufacturing process, how you're going to make the thing, If it's a biologic, it has a whole layer of complexity that is, and I find one of the biggest gaps is how you're going to walk this thing from a great idea into a couple of animals, let's say, into an early stage clinical trial. And there aren't a lot of good, innovative clinicians who understand the medicine and the clinical strategy to get something out the door, into a human, into the right design of humans, so you don't miss your primary endpoint, or you don't demonstrate your proof of concept in your first 20 whatevers you got to treat, and then raise the capital to do your phase 3 trial, and then make the mistake. So there's huge mistakes, landmines where great ideas go to die. And I see them go to die. And a problem is, by then you've raised enough money and you're far enough down the timeline cycle, you don't get a do-over. You don't get to raise $100 million and miss your primary endpoint on your phase 3 clinical trial and act like your investors are going to think that's funny. You don't get a do-over. And I can't tell you how many people that I see now and I consult with that have just, and then I hate the fact that they get too far downfield that they can't course correct. And you see them crashing into the wall and you can't stop them because they've told their board that they're going to do this pivotal trial with this cohort of patients that they're never going to enroll on the timeline that they projected to enroll, and they're going to run out of money, or they're going to not be powered well enough to meet the FDA's requirement for approval, and they're going to have to go and try to refinance the company with a big black mark or big red mark on their back. Anyway.
That's a harder story to sell, yeah, at that point. So when you were talking about, the ideas that you have, but your days are so busy, and, sometimes you just can't get to it because you're right, you're trying to get your patients out, overturn rooms, do your charts and everything. And so I know we talked about how organically the Innovask idea was sparked. Can you walk us through how Humacyte started, which was the other company that was on the simultaneous track?
So I can't speak for all surgeons or all scientists, but I am by nature a curious person, and I never met an operation or a thing I didn't want to try to make better. It's just that's the way I don't just want to do medicine, I want to change medicine. And I even give lectures on that topic of approaching, if you're in sort of the business of academic change, you should teach, you should, train people, and you should innovate. So I believe that in my DNA. With the Humacyte story, that's a tissue engineering story. It's really the progression of my science, which is understanding how blood runs through tubes at a very fundamental level. It sounds pretty, and in some ways it's pretty simple until you get into the weeds. But how blood runs through tubes, and when those tubes are artificial materials, I believe fundamentally the blood doesn't like it, and it knows the difference. And so my scientific journey had been to figure out how I could make a more blood biocompatible tube, which meant how do I understand the surface of a tube? Long story. And that was a lot of discovery science. Is how do blood cells interact with blood lining cells? Because God made that unique for a purpose. So that's where my science lived. And then sometimes there's things, serendipity, it does happen. I met a colleague who was trying to engineer a tube while I was trying to line a tube with anticoagulant or lining materials. And it was initially discovery science, is you take your tube, I'll put my cells, we'll see if it works. And so it was very organically a progression of a natural scientific next question. And we started making these little tubes, and these tubes started working in little animals. And then we said, let's put them in bigger animals. And then it started working, and we said we should make a company out of that. And we made a company out of that, and then we got some funding for that company. And we got a lot of non-dilutional funding. The other thing I should mention is that if you're good at raising capital, for most of the companies that I've been involved with, I've been able to raise half of the money from non-dilutional validating sources. If you think of your lead investor as the NIH, who's given you peer review, blinded analysis of your idea and decides to give you a couple $1 million, that's pretty good validation as a lead investor. The federal government, the public, has decided to invest in my company. So anyway, we got a lot of SBIR, non-dilutional money for these ideas as we were spinning up a company. And then we were able to build a little company to make these blood vessels that turned into a bigger company to make these blood vessels. And then, as I say, what really was an inflection point in my own life was this was really now working to the point where if we're putting this in little animals, we got to put it in big animals called humans. And if you're tissue engineering blood vessels, you got to figure out how to make a human blood vessel for a human, which meant we had to raise real money. Because this is all bioprocessing that's never been done before, which means we have to raise real money. And when I say we made the mistake of raising $150 million, that was a huge gravitational pull on me doing something that I had never really contemplated, which was leaving my tenured professor post at a great university to go run a biotech company and do it through its clinical trials. But you kind of got enough, the commitment is now there. It's like you put your money on the table, and if you don't do it, who else is going to do it? And both as the surgeon and one of the scientists and one of the sort of lead innovators, you got to own the thing. So anyway, that was a very organic journey to see if we could tissue engineer a human, and we figured, actually I say this in some of the lectures I've given, but engineering biomaterials, we're now at that inflection point where we understand cells and proteins and structure well enough, and we understand engineering well enough that the fields of biology and engineering are truly merging. And I think there'll be a time in my life where I'll tell people, can you believe we used to put synthetic materials made of Teflon and Dacron and stainless steel in people? And why? I mean, why, if Mother Nature's really smart and had hundreds of millions of years to work on this problem, why did it choose proteins like collagen and fibronectin and other things? It's because they're the best structural things to engineer us for all of the things that we need to do through our lifetime. We're just learning how those molecules work in a way and can organize them to make structure. And in my case, the structure was a blood vessel, because it's a pretty simple little organ that I was smart enough to be able to figure out a little bit about how it works. I'm not smart enough to make a kidney yet, but I know Mother Nature knows how to do it because it makes kidneys in the wombs of pregnant women all around the world every day. We just don't understand the cell biology well enough yet, but we might someday, and we might make kidneys. I don't know. I know we can make tubes, and we can probably make bones, and we can make cartilage and other structural elements that will replace the synthetic materials that we currently use. And I believe that has been solved, like Motorola solved the cell phone problem, 25 years ago, and then it iteratively engineered into the iPhone that's sitting in everybody's pocket. But bioengineering is doing that in real time right now. Anyway, that's a long-winded sort of.
That was exactly what I wanted you to hear. I heard that last night over sushi, and talking about kidneys over sushi is not recommended. But it's so inspiring. Dr. Lawson, you have such hope and, such a positive outlook for where science and medicine can progress. And I was inspired at dinner. So I want to ask you one more question, and then if there's anyone in the audience who has a question or two before we wrap up, I want, to wrap this all up, what's next on the horizon for you with starting a fund and being on the side of the table where you'll be able to provide capital to scientists and clinicians and folks who have innovative ideas to improve patient care. What's the biggest, kind of piece of advice you would give to people now that you're on this side of the table? Generally speaking, specifically anything, but would love to just hear that.
So, thanks, and thanks again for the invitation to speak. So, I could say at this stage, you mentioned like I build canoes, I build all kinds of stuff. In some ways, what I do in a wood shop is what I do in the ORs. You just build things and fix things if you understand how they work. Someday I'll probably end my journey by teaching high school biology in a public school and having a wood shop in the woods somewhere. That's all, that's kind of the end game. But between then and now, I am at a stage where I have had a lot of different experiences that all have their own elemental value for me, and then I think and I'm at the stage where I can share that. Not share it because my ego has to, I need to, but in the sense of giving back and seeing a lot of brilliant clinicians and scientists have great ideas and not know someone who speaks their language well enough to figure out how to get those ideas out the door. So I learned the language initially of sort of science and then surgery, and I learned how to be bilingual between those two worlds. And then by happenstance, I had to learn the language of business. And now I think my biggest asset is to communicate between those worlds. And so I do invest in companies, not just personally, but as a fund, and I help other people make strategic decisions about good ideas to invest in that I think will make a difference. And so my real hope, and to help those people who have those great ideas figure out how that idea can make a difference. So as you mentioned, we're actually in the process of raising the capital for that very early, very university-focused, first money in, out the door once a company's been formed and it needs that first $1 million, $2 million bucks. Swift Street Capital, this is not an advertisement, but I also run another fund called MedBlue. That's Duke-centric specifically, where we invest in very early, a couple $100,000. So I can be able to now help deploy capital. I sit on the NIH study section, so at the federal level, that's a deploying capital in another way where you're evaluating science. And then I find myself being able to help people who want to make a difference, as I do, and I still like to make a difference, and someday I'd be happy to go back and operate too. I just renewed my 10-year vascular board certification so I can operate if I get fired from everything. So, but I like that too. That's a great job. So, but the biggest thing is now I think at this stage, if I can really help other people be successful and drive joy from seeing their ideas make it to the light of day. So.
I love that. Well, do we have any audience questions for the few minutes that we have? I think we have time for one question, maybe two, and if not, then I would like to just have everyone thank Dr. Lawson for this inspiring discussion, for, walking through your experiences, the courage it takes to, leave an OR, innovate, and deliver patient care on a broad basis and not just the patient that's in front of you. So we thank you.
Thank you, Neela. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. Very insightful. We appreciate your thoughts and advice and your inspiring stories.